Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So, today in this presentation, I'd like to talk about the fracture mechanics study, experimental study on the creep crack growth in submicron thick, very, very thin metric films. So first, I give you a motivation of the study. So, as you know, remarkable characteristic of thin film is a large surface area to volume ratio compared with bulk counterparts. And also metallic film formed by vapor deposition generally consists of fine grains of size comparable with film thickness. So, you know, the surface and grain boundaries are first diffusion plus of atoms, and so the creep in thin film becomes very active even at room temperature. So we consider that the creep is one of the most important deformation and fracture mechanism, even at the room temperature for such thin material, thin component. So we consider we need to study the creep and creep fracture properties of such kind of small component. And the fracture mechanics is often used to characterize the creep crack propagation properties in bulk material. And many experimental studies have confirmed that the creep J integral, J star, or often called as C star integral, is a dominant fracture mechanics parameter of creep crack propagation, the DADT, and the large-scale creep condition. However, my question is, in submicron thick, very thin films, so what is the effective fracture mechanics parameter of creep crack propagation? As far as I know, this is still open question. So the purpose of the study is to clarify the effective mechanical parameter dominating the creep crack propagation of submicron films. And the tested materials are gold submicron film with thicknesses about 240 and 390 nanometers, and it's deposited by radio frequency magnetron sputtering method, and the impurity of the sputtering target is more than 3.9. And these are EDSD maps on the surface of these films, and you can see a strong 111 preferred texture, and you can see very fine grains, and the geometric mean of grain size is less than 100 nanometers. And in this study, we use freestanding and large area specimens on the order of millimeters. And the reason why we choose the large area specimen is to investigate the long distance, stable, or slow crack propagation of the film. And we utilize two types of specimen, two types of hourglass type specimen with different specimen widths. The one is 2 millimeter and 1 millimeter to clarify the dominant mechanical parameter of creep crack propagation, irrespective of the specimen size. And also we introduce the initial notch by FID. The length of the half length of the notch is in the range of about 24 to 100 micrometers. And during the experiment, we evaluate the total crack length 2A and also the crack center opening displacement of B. And this slide shows the experimental setup for creep testing of thin films, which we developed previously. And this is a front view and photograph, and this is a schematic of the side view. And this apparatus can apply dead load using weight here on the film specimen, like ring mechanism. This ring mechanism moves like this, and we can apply dead load effectively to the thin films. So the mechanism limits the loading direction in the downward direction. And also we measure the elongation of the film using a laser extensiometer attached here. And we conducted all the experiments at room temperature and in laboratory air. So, in the next few slides, I'd like to show you some experimental results. And this is a result of experiment, of CRIP experiment, the specimen with about 390 nanometers. And this is an optical microscope around the initial notch. And this is a photograph at the starting point t equals 0, and you can see some wrinkle or out of plane deformation around the notch. And then, with the passage of time, and crack began to propagate at each notch root, and you can see striped, vertically striped wrinkle deformation around the notch. And then crack gradually propagated almost normal to the floating direction, and the crack stably propagated, and then the specimen unstably fractured. And thus the experiments confirmed that the crack slowly propagated even at the room temperature in the gold submicron fields. And this figure plots propagation curve, or the relationship between half crack length and time. And you can see at the very early stage of crack propagation stage. So the magnified view is shown here. The crack growth rate is very high at the very early stage of experiment. And then the crack growth is decelerated and slowly propagated in a long distance and gradually accelerated. And at this point, unstably fractured. So the reason of the high crack growth rate at the very early stage may be due to the high driving force for CRIP crack propagation and the small scale CRIP condition. And these are the micrograph of the fracture surfaces. And in the near root region, or in the early stage of experiment, you can see the ductile chisel point type fracture in the very local region. On the other hand, we can see any CRIP damages on the film surfaces. So this suggested that the crack propagated accompanied with CRIP deformation in the very local region. So in other words, CRIP propagated under the small scale CRIP condition at the early stages. And on the other hand, in the other regions, or almost the entire experiment, the fracture surfaces are characterized by very fine roughness. And you can see also on the film surfaces, you can see the very fine roughnesses. So the region of CRIP deformation is several micrometers away from the crack passes. So this suggested that the crack propagated accompanied by large CRIP deformation around the crack tip. So in other words, the crack propagated under the large scale CRIP condition in this case. I'd like to discuss the dominant mechanical parameter for the crack propagation. And first, I'd like to consider the stress intensity factor. So this diagram indicates the crack propagation rate DADT with respect to the stress intensity factor K. And you can see the DADT decreases in spite of increasing K in the small K region. And then the DADT gradually increases with increasing K. So the important point is you can see the relation clearly depended on the specimen size. So we can conclude that the stress intensity factor K does not uniquely correlate with DADT. This is because, as I mentioned, the crack propagated in a widespread CRIP deformation region, so the use of elastic stress intensity factor K is not valid for this case. So next, I consider the use of CRIP-J integral. So in this study, we estimated the CRIP-J integral using a plane stress model described here by using a finite element method. And analysis assumes that the gold film obeys conventional power law type constitutive equation And we use the material constant N and A, which were evaluated by experiment for smooth thin film specimen, and obtained value that is listed here. And the clip properties are a little different between two film thicknesses. And this is an example of analysis and diagram showing the transition of J star values. You can see the J star decreases and then reaches a steady state value J star S. And from the analysis, we can determine the transition time TTR. So in this case, the TTR is on the order of 10 to the third power second. And from the analysis, we evaluated the transition time TTR for all the specimens we conducted and summarized in this table. And also in this table, we list the experimental fracture time, TTF. So you can see clearly the transient time, TTR, is much shorter than the fracture time. So this suggested that in these experiments, in almost the entire crack propagation stages, the crack propagated under the steady state or large-scale creep condition. So in that case, J star S characterized the single stress field. So we evaluated the relationship between the DADT and the steady state creep J integral J star S. So here, the J star S the values were evaluated by the simple approximate equation. The equation is verified by the FEM analysis, and this equation using the experimental net stress and DVDT. Yes, B is the crack center opening stress we measure from the experiment. And you can see in this diagram, all the results are within a very narrow band, irrespective of the specimen size and also the applied gross stress. So the results suggested that the steady-state creep J integral J star S was the dominant mechanical parameter of the creep propagation rate of the gold submicron field. And finally, I'd like to discuss the thickness effect on the creep propagation property. So in this figure, the results from the old experiment are listed, plotted. And you can see that all the results are close to each other irrespective of the film thickness. So this result indicated that the creep crack propagation properties are insensitive to the film thickness, at least in the thickness range from 240 and 390 nanometers. So as far as I know, this is the first study to experimentally clarify the validity of using the creep J integral for such very thin metric material. So we believe that provide a rationale for the strength evaluation of this type of structure. So finally, I'd like to summarize my talk. So in this study, we investigate the creep crack propagation behavior at room temperature of submicron gold film. And the main finding of the study is as follows. And first, the steady state creep J integral J star S is the dominant mechanical parameter that characterizes the creep crack propagation rate DADT. And the second, the creep crack propagation properties are insensitive to the film thickness, at least in the thickness range between 240 and 390. So that's all I'd like to say today. So thank you very much for your time.